All right, ready to dive in. Today's story is a heavy one.
Oh, yeah, this one's gonna stay with you.
It's about the Banaba people
You might know them as the Barnaby people.
and their home, Ocean Island. I got hooked on this one as soon as you sent me the source.
Gosh, tell it to the judge, right?
That title is just begging for a deep dive.
Yeah.
It's like a preview of everything packed into this case: colonialism, exploitation, and a fight for justice that just won't quit.
It's a story that asks some tough questions like, what happens when an entire island is stripped bare?
And who pays the price? So, to really get this, we got to rewind, right? Back to 1900.
Picture this. Albert Ellis, a young guy from New Zealand, steps onto Ocean Island.
And he just stumbles upon a phosphate gold mine.
Pretty much. This island's practically made of this stuff, perfect for making fertilizer.
But hold on, the Banaba people were already living there, weren't they? What was their life like before all this?
They had a pretty simple life, relying on fishing and their coconut trees.
A peaceful existence, until Ellis shows up with a 999-year mining lease.
Can you imagine that? 999 years.
That's longer than most countries have even existed. So what did this agreement actually say?
Well, they called it a lease, but it was more like a license to dismantle the island. They had the right to basically remove everything except the rock pinnacles.
Wow, like hollowing out the island. Did the Banaba people understand what they were getting into?
It's a classic case of an uneven playing field. A powerful company comes in, uses all this technical jargon.
And they're dealing with an indigenous population who may not fully grasp what a 999-year lease really means.
Or the sheer scale of destruction it could cause. It's a recurring theme in colonial history, unfortunately.
It sends shivers down my spine just thinking about it. But there was some pushback, wasn't there? Wasn't there a colonial officer, Quayle Dixon, who tried to speak up for the Banaba people?
Yes, Dixon. He saw the injustice brewing right from the start.
And you really wanted to protect them.
But his efforts didn't exactly get a warm welcome. He ended up getting
So
transferred.
the company got to him, huh?
Pretty much. Economic interests, as they often do, won out over doing the right thing.
Sounds familiar. But it seems like Dixon wasn't alone. Others had concerns too, right?
There were a few other officers who saw the writing on the wall, worried about the damage to the island and the unfair treatment of the Banaba people.
But their warnings fell on deaf ears.
Exactly. And then, in 1920, things shifted again. The British government bought the mining company.
So now the British government's directly responsible for what's happening on Ocean Island. How did the Banaba people react to this?
They didn't just sit back and take it. Resistance started brewing.
Really? Tell me more about that.
A young guy named Rotan Tito emerged as a leader.
A young guy stepping up, that's powerful.
Yeah.
What did this resistance look like?
There's a scene described in the video that really paints a picture. As the mining ramped up, the Banaba women clung to their coconut trees for dear life.
They were literally watching their homes and livelihoods vanish.
Yeah, it was more than just resources to them. It was their culture, their connection to the land, everything they knew.
That image is heartbreaking. But then World War II hit and things got even worse, right?
Yeah, the war piled on even more hardship. The Japanese occupied Ocean Island, and many Banaba people were forced into labor camps.
Awful. And this turmoil ended up giving the British government an opening to relocate them to Rambi Island in Fiji.
It was a turning point, and a deeply tragic one. It wasn't just a move, It tore apart their whole way of life. Everything they knew, everything they were, was tied to Ocean Island.
Rambi Island must have felt like a completely different world.
They were refugees in their own land, really.
Stripped of their home, forced to rebuild their lives in a strange place. That's got to be tough.
It was a huge struggle for them to adapt.
But amidst all this chaos, Rotan Tito never backed down, did he?
Not a chance.
Yeah.
He was determined to fight for his people, even traveling all the way to London to plead their case.
He just wouldn't give up, huh?
His dedication is inspiring, really. And then they uncovered something that added another layer of injustice to this whole situation.
You're talking about the royalty rates, right?
Oh, exactly. They found out they were getting practically nothing compared to what phosphate was actually worth on the world market.
No way.
Yeah.
So not only were they forced off their land and stripped of their culture, but they were also being ripped off financially.
It's a truly awful situation. After enduring all this, there comes a point where enough is enough, right?
So they finally decided to take legal action.
They did. They took on the British phosphate commissioners and the British government.
Wow, that's David versus Goliath. But how did they even find a lawyer willing to take on such a big case?
It's a pretty wild story. Rotan Tito was alone in London, and he ran into a man who was about to end his own life.
He stopped him.
Yeah, he talked him out of it. And get this, that man happened to have connections to a lawyer who was ready to fight for them.
You can't make this stuff up. Talk about fate. So what were the main arguments they brought to court?
They focused on two big things. First, they argued that the company hadn't replanted coconut trees like they promised.
Leaving the island barren and impossible to live on.
Right. And second, they challenged how the British government managed their trust fund.
Hold on. What exactly is a trust fund in this case? I'm not sure I follow.
Basically, it's a legal setup where someone, a trustee, manages assets for the benefit of someone else, the beneficiary.
Okay, so in this case, the British government was supposed to be managing the money made from the phosphate for the Banaba people.
Exactly. They argued the government messed up big time, putting their own interests ahead of the Banaba people.
Decades of frustration and a burning desire for justice led them to this courtroom. They weren't just after money. They wanted the world to know what had been done to them.
And get this, the judge actually went to see Ocean Island and Ramby Island for himself.
Whoa! He didn't just sit in his chambers reading reports.
He wanted to see the devastation firsthand and hear directly from the Banaba people. It was a pretty big deal.
That's incredible. So after all that, what was the verdict? Did he rule in their favor?
Well, it's complicated. He ruled in their favor on the coconut tree issue.
At least a win somewhere.
He said the company clearly broke their promise to replant.
But what about the British government? Did they get held responsible for their actions?
This is where it gets tricky. The judge said the British government had a moral obligation to the Banaba people.
So he agreed they were wrong.
He even called out specific actions by the British government as outrageous.
But he still ruled in favor of the government on the trust fund issue. How is that possible?
Sometimes legal frameworks, especially when dealing with historical injustices, just aren't equipped to deliver true justice.
The law failed them.
In a way, yes. But even though he ruled for the government, the judge didn't let them off the hook entirely.
He called them out.
Publicly. He basically used his position to shame them into taking some responsibility. He couldn't force them to pay, but he could put them on blast in the eyes of the public.
Bold move. So what did the British government do? Did they face any consequences?
Well, that's where things take another turn. Things got interesting for the British government after that ruling.
I bet. They were called out on a global stage, right?
Yeah. They couldn't exactly ignore it.
So did they own up to their mistakes and pay the full £21 million?
Well, not quite. They eventually agreed to an out-of-court settlement, but it wasn't the full amount.
Okay, so how much did they end up paying?
It was around £6.5 million.
That's still a decent chunk of change, but it's a far cry from what the Banaba people were asking for. It feels like they got shortchanged.
Yeah, it was a bit of a mixed bag.
And to add another layer of complexity, didn't they call it an ex gratia payment? What does that even mean?
Basically, it meant they were paying out of goodwill, not because they admitted any legal fault.
So they were trying to save face, acknowledging some responsibility, but not really taking the blame.
You could see it that way.
But did the Banaba people accept this?
They did, eventually.
I can only imagine how torn they must have felt.
It was a tough decision for them. On the one hand, they were finally getting some recognition.
But it still wasn't the full justice they deserved. Their story just highlights how sometimes, even when you take a case to court, the outcome can feel incomplete.
Yeah, it shows the limits of the legal system, especially when it comes to these kinds of historical wrongs. How can you possibly put a price tag on the loss of an entire culture and homeland?
We started this deep dive asking what happens when an island's resources are completely stripped away. The Banaba people's experience tells us the answer: a legacy of loss, displacement, environmental damage, and a long, painful fight for justice.
It's a story that makes you stop and think, doesn't it? It reminds us that the pursuit of profit can have devastating consequences, both for people and the environment.
And it reinforces the need to listen to the voices of those who are often overlooked and silenced.
The Banaba people never gave up. Their resilience is remarkable.
This deep dive has been truly eye-opening. The story of the Banaba people and Ocean Island is a complicated one, filled with colonialism, exploitation, and the constant struggle for justice.
It's a story that stays with you.
It certainly does. What stands out to you most from all of this? What will you take away from it? Share your thoughts with us. And until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.